Long before the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic world already stretched across continents. From the Atlantic shores of North Africa to the distant edges of Central Asia, one empire held it together, the Umayyad Caliphate. At a glance, it looked unstoppable. Its armies had moved faster than any force before them. Cities had fallen in rapid succession. Entire regions had been absorbed into a system that, within a few generations, had become one of the largest political entities the world had ever seen. But empires are rarely defined by what they conquer. They are defined by what they cannot control. And beneath the surface of Umayyad's strength, something quieter was already beginning to form. Not rebellion, not yet, but distance. In Damascus, where the Umayyad caliphs ruled, power felt close, immediate, and unquestioned. Decisions were made at the center, and from that center, authority radiated outward across deserts, mountains, and rivers. But the further that authority traveled, the weaker it became. In the eastern provinces, far beyond the heart of Syria, the empire felt different. There, power did not arrive as certainty. It arrived as instruction. Tax collectors, governors, military officials, all representing a distant authority that many had never seen and would never meet. And over time, that distance began to matter. The empire had expanded faster than it could integrate. Cities were conquered, but not fully absorbed. Peoples were ruled, but not always included. And within this imbalance, a quiet tension began to settle across the lands the Umayyads claimed to control. At the center of this tension was something simple but powerful. Who truly belonged to the empire? The Umayyad system had been built on conquest, and at its core remained an Arab ruling elite. Those who had come from the Arabian Peninsula, who had participated in the early expansions, who were tied by lineage and identity to the origins of the Islamic State. They occupied the highest positions of power. They governed. They commanded. They benefited. But beyond them existed a growing population that did not fit cleanly into that structure. Non-Arab converts to Islam, known as Mawali, had embraced the religion, adopted its practices, and aligned themselves with the expanding Islamic world. Yet their place within the system remained uncertain. They were part of the empire, but not equal within it. In many regions, they still faced taxation that Arab Muslims did not. They were often excluded from positions of authority. And while the religion they followed spoke of unity, the political system they lived under did not always reflect it. This contradiction did not explode into open conflict immediately. Instead, it settled into something slower. Resentment. Not loud, not organized, but present and spreading. In cities across Persia, in the distant province of Khorasan, in communities that had once belonged to entirely different empires, this tension began to take root. Because people do not only respond to power, they respond to fairness. And when a system expands without resolving its internal contradictions, those contradictions begin to define it. At the same time, another layer of tension was forming, one tied not to identity but to legitimacy. The Umayyads ruled as caliphs, leaders of the Islamic world. But not everyone agreed that they should. Memories of earlier leadership had not faded. The question of who had the rightful claim to lead the Muslim community still lingered beneath the surface. Some believed leadership should remain within the family of the Prophet. Others accepted the existing system. And many simply lived within it, even as uncertainty remained unresolved. This was not yet a unified opposition. It was something more subtle, a landscape of doubt. And doubt, when left unresolved, becomes fertile ground for change. Across the empire, the Umayyads continued to govern, to expand, to maintain control. From the outside, the system still functioned. Trade flowed. Armies moved. Cities prospered. But internally, the structure was no longer as solid as it appeared. Because empires are not held together by force alone. They are held together by belief. Belief that the system is fair. Belief that authority is legitimate. Belief that participation brings stability. And when that belief weakens, even the strongest empires begin to shift. Far from Damascus, in the eastern regions where imperial control was less direct, these shifts were becoming more visible. Khorasan, in particular, stood at the edge of the known Islamic world. A frontier province, a meeting point of cultures, languages, and histories. Here, Arab settlers lived alongside local populations who had recently come under Islamic rule. Here, the distinctions between ruler and ruled were more difficult to maintain. And here, the contradictions of the Umayyad system were felt more sharply than anywhere else. Because in Khorasan, the empire was not an abstract idea. It was daily reality. Taxes collected, orders enforced, opportunities granted or denied. And as years passed, something began to change in how people understood their place within that system. They no longer saw it as permanent. They saw it as something that could be different. Not immediately, not openly, but eventually. And that shift from acceptance to possibility is where all transformations begin. The Umayyad Caliphate had built an empire through speed and strength. But it had not yet solved the problem of inclusion. It had created unity in territory, but not always in identity. And as these gaps widened, they created space. Space for new ideas. Space for new movements. Space for new claims to legitimacy. Somewhere within that space, a new force was beginning to form. Not yet visible, not yet powerful, but growing, quietly, patiently, and with an understanding of the system it would one day challenge. Because the next great shift in Islamic history would not come from outside the empire. It would come from within it. At first, nothing seemed to change. The Umayyad Caliphate still ruled from Damascus. Its governors still enforced authority across distant lands. Its armies still stood as a reminder that power, when needed, could be used. But empires do not unravel in visible ways at the beginning. They shift in silence. Across the vast territory of the Islamic world, the tensions that had once remained scattered and unconnected were beginning to move towards something else. Connection. Not openly, not yet as a unified movement, but as a growing awareness that dissatisfaction was not isolated. In cities far apart from one another, people were beginning to realize they were experiencing the same contradictions, the same imbalance, the same distance from power. And once that realization begins, opposition stops being local. It becomes systemic. In the eastern province of Khorasan, this shift was especially clear. Khorasan was not like Damascus. It was not a center of power. It was a frontier, a place where cultures met and overlapped, where Arab settlers lived among Persian populations, where the distinctions that defined the Umayyad system became harder to maintain. Here, the idea of belonging to the empire was not as simple as it was at the center. Because people lived the contradictions daily. Non-Arab Muslims, those who had accepted Islam but were not part of the Arab elite, formed a growing part of the population. They prayed in the same mosques, followed the same religion, lived under the same authority, but they did not share the same status. They paid taxes that others did not. They faced limits that others avoided. And over time, this created something deeper than frustration. It created a sense of exclusion within a system that claimed unity. At the same time, Arab settlers in Khorasan were not entirely stable in their position either. They were far from the center of power, far from Damascus, far from the Caliph. Their authority depended not only on imperial support, but on their ability to maintain control locally. And that control was not always secure, because they too were living in a region where identity was shifting, where alliances were not fixed, where loyalty could not be assumed. Khorasan, more than any other region, had become a place where the empire's internal contradictions were exposed, and where those contradictions began to matter. It was here that something new started to take shape. Not a rebellion, not a war, but a network. At first, it moved quietly. Individuals speaking to individuals. Ideas shared in small gatherings. Messages passed without drawing attention. There was no single moment where it began. No declaration. No clear starting point. But gradually, these connections began to form a pattern. And that pattern began to carry a message. The Umayyad system was not inevitable. It could be replaced. This idea, once introduced, did not spread through force. It spread through recognition. Because people already felt the imbalance. They already understood the distance between the ideals of the empire and its reality. The idea of change did not need to convince them that something was wrong. It only needed to suggest that something else was possible. At the center of this growing movement was a claim, not just political, but moral, that leadership of the Islamic world should belong to those connected to the family of the Prophet. That authority should reflect legitimacy, not just power. This claim was not new. It had existed in different forms before. But now it was being organized, structured, turned into something that could move beyond isolated belief, into coordinated action. And within that structure, a name began to emerge. The family of Al-Abbas, relatives of the Prophet through his uncle, a lineage that could carry both political and religious weight. At first, this connection was not openly declared. The movement did not present itself directly. It operated under a broader idea. Support for the chosen one from the family of the Prophet. A message that allowed flexibility, that allowed people with different interpretations to align under a single cause. This ambiguity was not weakness. It was strategy, because it allowed the movement to grow without immediately revealing its full identity. And growth at this stage mattered more than clarity. Across Khorasan and beyond, this message began to take root. Not in public spaces, but in private ones, in conversations, in quiet agreements, in shared understanding. And as it spread, it began to unify groups that had once remained separate. Non-Arab Muslims who felt excluded. Arab settlers who felt distant from central authority. Religious groups dissatisfied with Umayyad legitimacy. Each with different reasons, but now with a shared direction. Opposition was no longer scattered. It was aligning. Meanwhile, the Umayyad Caliphate continued to function. From the outside, little had changed. Governors still ruled. Taxes were still collected. The system still operated. But it was no longer operating alone. Because beneath it, another system was forming. Not yet visible, not yet powerful enough to challenge directly, but increasingly organized. increasingly aware, and increasingly patient. This patience would define everything that followed, because the movement that was forming did not intend to challenge the Umayyads immediately. It intended to outlast them, to grow within the spaces their system could no longer fully control, to build connections where authority was weakest, and to wait, because timing, more than strength, determines the success of transformation. And the time had not yet come, but it was approaching, slowly, quietly, and with a momentum that the ruling power had not yet fully recognized. The Umayyad Caliphate still held the empire, but it no longer held its future. In the final years of the Umayyad Caliphate, the empire still looked intact from a distance. Cities continued to function, trade still moved across deserts and rivers, governors still ruled in the name of the Caliph in Damascus. But underneath that surface, something irreversible had already begun. The system was no longer just being questioned. It was being replaced in the imagination of the people who lived inside it. And once imagination shifts, reality follows. In the eastern province of Khorasan, where distance from Damascus was not just geographic but emotional, the quiet networks of opposition had now matured into something more structured. What had once been scattered conversations had become coordinated messaging. What had once been shared frustration had become shared direction. And what had once been vague dissatisfaction had become a defined expectation that the current order would not last. This expectation did not spread through public declarations. It spread through trust, through messengers moving between communities, through gatherings held away from official eyes, through agreements formed in silence rather than ceremony. And in that silence, a movement was being built that the central authority could not easily see. At the heart of this movement was a powerful unifying idea: that leadership of the Islamic world should not remain tied only to political dominance. It should be tied to legitimacy, to lineage, to connection with the Prophet's family. This idea gave emotional weight to what might otherwise have remained a political disagreement, because it transformed dissatisfaction into moral structure. And moral structure is far more powerful than simple rebellion. In Khorasan, this message found especially fertile ground. The population was layered and complex. Arab settlers lived alongside local Persian populations who had been integrated into the empire after conquest. Non-Arab Muslims, who had adopted Islam but remained socially and politically secondary within the Umayyad system, carried deep frustration that was not easily resolved. They were part of the religious community, but not fully part of its power structure. And that contradiction had been present long enough to harden into expectation. In such environments, a new message does not need to create dissatisfaction. It only needs to organize it. And that is exactly what began to happen. The movement did not initially present itself as a direct challenge to the ruling dynasty. It moved carefully, indirectly. It spoke in broad terms about justice, unity, and rightful leadership. It avoided naming itself too clearly. It allowed different groups to interpret its message in ways that suited their own grievances. This flexibility was not accidental. It was essential, because a movement still forming cannot afford premature exposure. It must grow before it is recognized, and it must be recognized only when it is already too large to stop easily. Behind this growing structure stood the influence of the Abbasid family, relatives of the Prophet through his uncle Al-Abbas. Their name carried symbolic weight, but the movement around them did not rely solely on personal identity. It relied on coordination, on networks, on trust built over time rather than authority imposed from above. And in Khorasan, a particularly important figure began to shape this process more clearly: Abu Muslim. Not a king, not a caliph, but a strategist of connection. Under his influence, the movement in Khorasan began to take on a more disciplined structure. Messages were standardized. Support was organized. Local leaders were coordinated into a wider framework. And slowly, what had been an idea became an organization. Meanwhile, the Umayyad Caliphate continued to govern as if the system beneath it was still stable. From Damascus, the empire still appeared vast and controlled. But distance had always been its weakness. And now that weakness was becoming structural. Governors in distant provinces increasingly acted with autonomy. Local tensions were handled locally, and central authority often only learned of problems after they had already grown. This delay between cause and response created space. And in that space, movements could grow. The Abbasid network in Khorasan did not yet openly declare war. Instead, it expanded influence. It built alliances quietly. It embedded itself in existing frustrations rather than replacing them outright. And this approach made it difficult to isolate, because it did not behave like a traditional rebellion. It behaved like an alternative system forming within the old one. By the time Damascus began to fully recognize the scale of what was happening in the East, the situation had already changed. The movement was no longer small. It was no longer local. It was coordinated across regions. And it was no longer purely reactive. It was preparing for action, not impulsively, but with structure, with timing, and with a clear understanding of the weaknesses of the system it was about to challenge. The Umayyad Caliphate still held authority, but authority alone was no longer enough, because beneath it, another structure had already formed. And structures, once formed, do not remain hidden forever. Eventually, they move into the open. And when they do, the balance of power stops being theoretical and becomes real. There are moments in history when a system does not fall because it is attacked. It falls because it can no longer hold itself together. For the Umayyad Caliphate, that moment arrived not in a single battlefield, but across many fronts at once, as the structure that had once held the empire together began to loosen under its own weight. From Damascus, the center still issued commands, governors still governed, armies still moved when called, but the rhythm of obedience had changed. Orders were no longer followed with the same certainty. And in an empire built on distance, that change was fatal. In the East, the movement that had begun in silence had now fully taken shape. The network that had once spoken in fragments now spoke with coordination. What had once been shared dissatisfaction had become structured opposition. And what had once been invisible had become unavoidable. The Abbasid cause was no longer an idea moving quietly through Khorasan. It was an organized force embedded within the region itself. Led through coordination rather than central spectacle, it relied on networks that had grown patiently over time. And patience, in this moment, became decisive. Because the Umayyad system was still reacting as if it were facing isolated unrest, not a unified transformation. That misjudgment created space. Space for organization. Space for movement. Space for action. In Khorasan, support for the Abbasid cause now extended across multiple layers of society. Non-Arab Muslims, long excluded from full participation in the ruling structure, saw in the movement a possibility of recognition that had never been granted to them. Arab settlers, far from the political center, saw an alternative to a system that no longer felt fully responsive to their needs. Local leaders, navigating between imperial demands and regional realities, began to shift cautiously toward the emerging structure. And beneath all of them, a growing sense of inevitability began to take hold. That the existing order was not simply being challenged. It was being replaced. At the center of this transformation stood coordinated leadership in the East, where figures like Abu Muslim helped convert scattered support into structured alignment. What mattered now was not simply belief. It was organization. Messages were standardized. Local networks were integrated. And resistance to the existing order was no longer just emotional or ideological. It was operational. The Abbasid movement did not need to rush. It needed only to continue growing while the existing system struggled to adapt. And the Umayyads, for their part, were now facing a problem they could no longer solve through traditional means. The empire was too large to monitor fully, too diverse to control uniformly, and too distant from its own edges to respond quickly enough to prevent consolidation of opposition. In Damascus, decisions were still made with the assumption that the center defined the periphery. But in practice, the periphery was now defining itself. And once that happens, central authority becomes reactive rather than directive. Military responses were still possible, but they were slower than the changes they were meant to contain. Governors were still appointed, but their ability to enforce control varied widely. And loyalty, once assumed, now had to be maintained. The Abbasid forces in the East understood this imbalance clearly. They did not attempt to confront the empire everywhere at once. They chose their moment. And when that moment arrived, it was not marked by declaration, but by coordinated action. The uprising in Khorasan unfolded with a level of organization that reflected years of preparation. Cities that had once been loosely connected now acted in alignment. Local forces that had once been fragmented now moved under shared direction. And resistance that had once been isolated now became unified pressure. The Umayyad response, though still powerful, was no longer sufficient to contain the scale of coordination now opposing it. What had once been a vast empire was now encountering something it had not fully anticipated. A movement that had grown within its own structure long enough to understand its weaknesses. And that understanding mattered more than numbers. Because the collapse of authority is rarely about force alone. It is about timing. And the Abbasid movement had waited until the timing was no longer in question. By the time the old order fully recognized the scale of the transformation, the outcome had already begun to settle. The Umayyad Caliphate was not just being challenged. It was being replaced. And as the structure it had built across generations began to give way, a new system was already preparing to take its place. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but inevitably. Because once an empire loses control of its own edges, the center cannot hold them for long. And what follows is no longer stability. It is transition. The collapse of the old order does not end when power is lost. It ends when a new center replaces it. For the rising Abbasid Caliphate, that moment began not with celebration, but with consolidation. Because taking control is only the first step. Holding it is the real test. After the upheaval in the East, the remaining structure of the Umayyad Caliphate still existed, but it no longer functioned as a unified system. Its authority had fractured. Its responses had slowed. And its legitimacy, once assumed, now had to be defended. What remained of Umayyad power was no longer centered in one stable reality. It was scattered across regions where loyalty varied, where governors acted with different levels of independence, and where the idea of a single unified command no longer felt absolute. In this weakened structure, the Abbasid movement transitioned from uprising to governance. And that transition is where revolutions are truly decided. In the East, Khorasan had been the engine of transformation. But once momentum reached critical mass, it no longer needed constant direction from its origin. It began to sustain itself. Cities that had once been loosely connected under hidden coordination now operated with open alignment. Local administrators shifted allegiance not just out of belief, but out of recognition that the previous system no longer controlled outcomes effectively. Military forces that had once defended the old order found themselves either absorbed or replaced. And within this shift, a new governing structure began to form. Not yet fully stable, but increasingly real. The Abbasid leadership understood something crucial at this stage. Revolutions do not succeed when they destroy an old system alone. They succeed when they replace its functions. Taxation, administration, communication, military organization. Without these, victory collapses into chaos. So instead of dispersing after success in the East, the movement began to organize. Power was no longer just seized. It was structured. At the same time, the symbolic center of authority was shifting. Damascus, long the seat of the Caliphate, no longer represented the full reality of the empire. Its distance from the eastern base of support made it increasingly disconnected from where power was now being generated. And in political systems, legitimacy follows control, not tradition. The Abbasid leadership recognized this shift and moved to establish a new center that reflected the reality of their support. A new capital was needed, not just as a city, but as a symbol of redefined authority. The process of relocation was not immediate. It was deliberate, because moving a capital is not just administrative. It is psychological. It tells the empire where power now resides, and where it no longer does. As this transition unfolded, the foundations of what would become Baghdad began to take shape. Chosen not randomly, but strategically, the location reflected both geography and intention. It sat at a point of connection between regions, allowing the Abbasid administration to project authority across diverse territories more effectively than the older center had managed in its later years. This was not just a change of capital. It was a restructuring of imperial logic. Power was no longer defined purely by inheritance or conquest. It was being defined by coordination. Within this new system, administration began to take on a more complex and layered form. Different groups within the Abbasid structure contributed to governance in ways that reflected the diversity of the empire itself. Persian administrative traditions influenced bureaucratic organization. Arab leadership traditions continued to shape political legitimacy. And Islamic principles provided the unifying framework that held the system together. This blending was not accidental. It was necessary, because an empire that spans multiple cultures cannot function through uniformity alone. It must function through integration. But integration always carries tension, because every system that absorbs diversity must also manage difference. And that balance would define much of what came next. Meanwhile, remnants of Umayyad authority attempted to regroup in other regions. But the center of gravity had shifted too far to reverse easily. What had once been a unified empire was now split between memory and emergence. The Abbasids did not simply inherit power. They redefined where power existed. And once that redefinition takes hold, the old structure becomes historical rather than functional. At this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer just a movement that had succeeded. It was a system that had begun to replace another system entirely. But replacement is not stability. It is transition extended over time. And transitions always contain uncertainty. Because the moment a new center is formed, it must prove that it can hold what it has taken. And that test was only just beginning. A new empire does not begin when a ruler declares it. It begins when a city begins to carry its weight. For the rising Abbasid Caliphate, that responsibility was now being anchored in a place that would soon define its identity. A city that did not yet fully exist as legend, but was already becoming more than geography. Baghdad was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because the old logic of empire no longer worked. Damascus had been a capital of conquest, but conquest alone could not hold a system as wide and diverse as the Abbasids now ruled. What was needed was something different, a center that did not simply command outward, but connected inward. The land where Baghdad would rise sat between worlds, between river systems that carried life, between trade routes that carried goods and ideas, between regions that had once been separate empires, now forced into a shared political reality. It was here that the Abbasids began building not just a capital, but a new type of imperial brain. At first, it was not a grand city. It was a controlled construction of intention. Workers arrived not just to build structures, but to define order. Canals were shaped to manage movement. Walls were designed to organize flow rather than merely defend. Administrative spaces were planned with the expectation that governance would expand rather than remain static. This was not a city reacting to empire. It was a city designed for it. As construction progressed, something subtle began to change across the Abbasid world. Power no longer felt like something distant and inherited. It began to feel organized, coordinated, structured in a way that suggested permanence. And that feeling mattered almost as much as reality. Because empires survive not only through control, but through belief in continuity. Across the former Umayyad territories, the remnants of the old order still existed, but they were increasingly isolated. Some regions maintained old loyalties out of habit rather than strength. Others had already shifted allegiance, aligning with the emerging Abbasid system. And many now existed in a state of quiet adjustment, waiting to see what kind of empire this new structure would become. In this uncertain environment, Baghdad became more than a construction site. It became a statement. It signaled that the center of power was no longer fixed to the old Mediterranean axis. It was moving eastward, toward regions that had once been viewed as periphery, but were now becoming core. Within this shifting structure, the Abbasid administration began to take shape in a more defined form. Governance was no longer just the extension of military victory. It was becoming an organized system of management. Officials were appointed not only for loyalty, but for function. Tax systems were refined to stabilize long-distance control. Communication networks were improved to reduce delay between center and province. And slowly, the empire began to operate less like a chain of command and more like a coordinated structure. But beneath this growing stability lay a constant tension. Because integration always creates complexity, and complexity always creates strain. Different traditions within the empire now interacted in ways that were not always smooth. Persian administrative methods reshaped bureaucratic life. Arab political identity still carried symbolic authority, and Islamic unity provided the ideological framework that justified the entire system. These elements did not always align perfectly, and the Abbasid leadership now faced a challenge that conquest alone could never solve: how to maintain unity in a system built on diversity. Meanwhile, the memory of the old Umayyad order had not disappeared completely. In distant regions, surviving members and loyalists still attempted to preserve fragments of the previous system. But without centralized power, their influence was increasingly fragmented. The old empire had not vanished in a single moment. It had dissolved unevenly. Some parts had been absorbed, some had resisted, and some had simply faded into irrelevance. What replaced it was not immediate stability, but structured uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, Baghdad continued to grow. Each new layer of construction reinforced the idea that this was not temporary authority. It was intended permanence. But permanence in empires is never guaranteed by design alone. It must be proven over time. And the Abbasids, having replaced one of the largest political systems of their age, were now entering the phase where building was no longer enough. They would have to govern, not just territories, but contradictions. And that challenge would define everything that followed. Empires do not survive because they conquer. They survive because they learn how to organize what conquest gives them. For the rising Abbasid Caliphate, this realization began to define the next stage of its existence, as the energy of revolution slowly hardened into structure. The fall of the old order had created space. But space alone is not power. It is only potential. And potential must be shaped. In the early years, after the establishment of the new regime, authority was still settling into form. The memory of the Umayyad Caliphate lingered in the background of political life, like a shadow that had not fully disappeared. Some regions still carried traces of old loyalties. Some administrators still operated using older habits of governance. And in distant provinces, the idea of central authority still felt distant, almost abstract, rather than immediate. The Abbasids understood that this could not continue. A system built only on victory would slowly unravel unless it became a system built on administration. And administration, unlike conquest, does not depend on speed. It depends on precision. From the growing center of Baghdad, a new political logic began to take shape. It was not the logic of expansion anymore. It was the logic of management. Territories were no longer simply acquired. They had to be governed. Populations were no longer just subjects of conquest. They were components of a system. And systems require coordination between parts that do not always naturally align. To achieve this, the Abbasid leadership began building layers of governance that reached far beyond the simple model of military governors that had defined earlier rule. Authority was distributed but carefully controlled. Local officials were granted responsibility, but always within a wider structure of oversight. Communication between center and province became more important than direct force alone. Because distance in such a vast empire was not just physical. It was administrative. And every delay in communication increased the risk of fragmentation. At the same time, a new class of governance began to emerge. Administrators, scribes, and officials who were not defined purely by military power, but by knowledge of systems, language, and procedure. These individuals became essential to the functioning of the Abbasid state. They translated commands into action. They maintained records. They ensured continuity between decisions made at the center and their execution across the empire. In doing so, they formed the hidden skeleton of imperial stability. Meanwhile, the physical center of power, Baghdad, continued to develop not just as a city, but as an idea made visible. It was not simply a capital. It was a statement that the empire had entered a new phase of organization. Its location, positioned between major cultural and economic regions, reflected this intention. It was designed to connect rather than simply command. And connection, in an empire this large, was more powerful than force alone. But even as structure expanded, tension remained beneath the surface. Because no system that integrates diverse populations can do so without friction. Different traditions within the empire continued to interact in complex ways. Persian administrative influence became increasingly visible in bureaucratic life. Arab political identity still carried symbolic authority in matters of legitimacy. And Islamic religious unity remained the foundation that justified the entire system. These elements worked together, but they did not always move in perfect alignment. And that misalignment created ongoing pressure within the system. Externally, the empire still faced regions that had not fully integrated into the new order. Some areas maintained a degree of autonomy. Others resisted central oversight quietly. And some remained in transitional states, neither fully inside nor fully outside the Abbasid structure. This unevenness was not a failure. It was a consequence of scale. Because the larger an empire becomes, the more variation it contains. And variation must be managed, not eliminated. The Abbasids began to understand that their challenge was no longer simply to rule territory. It was to maintain coherence across difference. And coherence is not something that can be imposed indefinitely. It must be maintained continuously. As Baghdad grew, so did the expectations placed upon it. It was no longer just the seat of authority. It was becoming the symbol of whether the new system could hold together what it had inherited. And that burden was heavier than conquest had ever been. Because conquest ends when victory is achieved. But governance begins at that point. And it never truly ends. The Abbasid Caliphate had moved beyond revolution. It had entered the long, silent labor of empire. And in that labor, its true strength and its first vulnerabilities would begin to emerge. Empires rarely notice the moment they become too large to behave like a single will. For the rising Abbasid Caliphate, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through distance, delay, and the growing difficulty of turning intention into action across vast lands. From the center of Baghdad, authority still appeared coherent. Orders were issued, officials were appointed, tax systems functioned, and on the surface, the empire retained the appearance of unity. But beneath that surface, the nature of control was changing. Because control is not only about command. It is about response. And response begins to weaken when distance becomes structural rather than geographical. Across the Abbasid territories, provinces no longer behaved like extensions of a single center. They behaved like semi-independent systems operating within a shared framework. Some regions remained closely aligned with Baghdad, following directives with relative consistency. Others adapted imperial commands to local conditions, reshaping instructions into forms that suited their own realities. And some, especially in distant frontier zones, began to act with a level of autonomy that blurred the line between obedience and independence. This was not rebellion. It was drift. And drift is how empires begin to loosen without breaking. Inside the administrative heart of the Abbasid system, the growing complexity of governance was becoming impossible to ignore. The same expansion that had brought wealth and influence also brought layers of management that now separated the center from the periphery. Orders passed through multiple stages before reaching their destination. Reports returned slowly, often already outdated by the time they arrived. And decisions made in Baghdad increasingly relied on information that was incomplete by the time it was acted upon. In earlier stages of empire, speed had defined power. But now scale had replaced speed. And scale demanded structure rather than immediacy. To manage this, the Abbasids leaned heavily on the administrative class that had already begun to take shape in earlier years. Scribes, officials, and bureaucrats became the true carriers of imperial continuity. They translated policy into procedure. They maintained records that allowed the empire to function beyond the limits of personal rule. And in doing so, they became more important than many of the military structures that had once defined conquest. But this shift also created a subtle transformation in power itself. Because when administration becomes essential, authority becomes less direct. And when authority becomes less direct, it becomes more dependent on interpretation. Different officials, working across different regions, began to interpret central directives in slightly different ways. Not out of disobedience, but necessity. Because no single instruction could fully account for the complexity of local conditions across such a vast empire. Over time, these small differences accumulated. And accumulation in an empire becomes structure. Meanwhile, Baghdad continued to grow in both symbolic and practical importance. It was no longer just the seat of governance. It was becoming the point through which the empire understood itself. Trade flowed through its markets. Knowledge passed through its institutions. And political decisions radiated outward from its administrative core. But with this centralization came a new burden. Because the more a system depends on a single center, the more pressure that center must absorb. And pressure, once concentrated, does not remain neutral. It reshapes the structure that contains it. Beyond the capital, the diversity of the empire became increasingly visible in everyday governance. Persian administrative traditions continued to influence bureaucratic structure. Arab identity still carried deep symbolic weight in matters of legitimacy and authority. And Islamic unity remained the ideological foundation that connected otherwise diverse populations. But these elements, while connected, were not identical, and maintaining alignment between them required constant effort. Because unity in a diverse empire is not a permanent condition. It is an ongoing process. In some regions, local elites began to gain more influence over how imperial policies were applied. In others, distance allowed regional identities to strengthen without direct interference from the center. And in frontier zones, local realities often shaped governance more than directives from Baghdad itself. The Abbasid system was still functioning, but it was no longer uniform. It was layered, and layered systems behave differently from unified ones. They adapt, they bend, they absorb pressure rather than resist it in a single direction. This adaptability gave the empire strength, but it also introduced unpredictability. Because what adapts locally does not always remain consistent globally. Within the ruling center, awareness of these changes was growing. But awareness did not always translate into control. Because correcting structural drift requires more than authority. It requires restructuring the system itself. And restructuring an empire of this scale is not a simple task. It is a long negotiation between ideal order and practical reality. By the end of this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer in a phase of expansion or revolution. It had entered something more complex, a phase of maintenance, where the challenge was no longer to build power, but to hold it together. And in that shift, the true nature of empire began to reveal itself, not as a moment of victory, but as a continuous struggle against distance, difference, and time. Empires rarely collapse in a single direction. They weaken unevenly in places where distance becomes too great, authority too thin, and loyalty too expensive to maintain. For the developing Abbasid Caliphate, the first real fractures did not appear in the capital. They appeared at the edges, in the distant provinces where Baghdad's voice was still heard, but no longer always obeyed with certainty. At first, the changes were almost invisible. A governor delayed implementing a directive. A region adjusted taxation in ways that better suited local conditions. A military commander acted first and reported later, rather than waiting for instruction. Each action, taken alone, seemed small enough to be ignored. But together, they revealed something deeper. The center was no longer the only source of initiative. And once initiative spreads outward, authority begins to shift shape. In Baghdad, the administration still functioned with remarkable sophistication. Bureaucratic systems continued to evolve, refining how information moved between provinces and the capital. Scribes and officials recorded details of governance with increasing precision, attempting to preserve clarity across a system that was becoming harder to fully oversee. But record-keeping, no matter how advanced, could not fully solve the problem of distance, because by the time information reached the center, it was already slightly outdated. And by the time decisions returned to the edges, circumstances had often changed again. This growing delay between reality and response became one of the most important structural pressures within the empire. It did not break the system immediately. Instead, it changed how the system behaved. Governors in distant regions began to rely more heavily on their own judgment. Local elites gained more influence in decision-making processes. And the practical reality of governance slowly shifted away from pure central control toward negotiated authority. This shift did not mean rebellion. It meant adaptation. And adaptation, once widespread, becomes structural change. Meanwhile, the ideological unity that had once helped stabilize the empire remained intact, but increasingly stretched across competing interpretations. The shared foundation of Islamic identity still connected diverse populations across the empire, but it no longer erased regional differences. Instead, it existed alongside them. In some regions, local customs merged with imperial governance in ways that created hybrid systems of authority. In others, older traditions reasserted themselves beneath the surface of Islamic rule. And in frontier zones, identity became layered rather than singular. These variations did not immediately threaten the empire, but they made it more complex. And complexity always changes how control functions. Within the administrative heart of the system, officials attempted to maintain coherence by refining procedures and strengthening communication channels. But every improvement introduced new layers of process. And every layer added time. And time in a vast empire is not neutral. It is pressure. Because delayed decisions create space for local interpretation. And local interpretation creates variation. And variation, over time, becomes divergence. Still, from the outside, the Abbasid Caliphate remained powerful. Trade continued to flow across its territories. Cities like Baghdad continued to flourish as centers of culture, knowledge, and administration. And the empire still projected the image of a unified political order stretching across continents. But internally, the nature of that unity was changing. It was becoming less about direct control and more about shared structure, a framework that held together regions that were no longer identical in their behavior, but still connected through overlapping systems of governance, religion, and administration. This kind of unity is more flexible than earlier imperial forms, but it is also more fragile, because it depends on alignment rather than uniformity. And alignment must be constantly maintained. In the eastern provinces, particularly in regions far from Baghdad, local authority continued to grow more self-sufficient. Not in open defiance, but in practical autonomy. Decisions were increasingly made at the local level because waiting for central approval was no longer efficient. And over time, efficiency becomes authority. The Abbasid center still defined the structure of the empire, but it no longer controlled every function within it directly. Instead, it influenced a system that now had multiple centers of practical power. And once an empire develops multiple centers, it begins to behave differently from one that has a single core. It becomes less like a unified body, and more like a network under strain. By the end of this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer in a phase of expansion or consolidation. It was entering a phase of tension management, where the challenge was not growth, but coherence. And coherence, once stretched across distance, becomes the most difficult form of stability to maintain. Empires do not only hold territory, they also hold ideas. And in the rising world of the Abbasid Caliphate, ideas were becoming one of the most powerful tools of governance. Not because they replaced armies or taxation, but because they helped explain why the system should exist at all. In the growing heart of the empire, Baghdad was no longer just an administrative center. It was becoming something deeper, a place where knowledge itself was being gathered, organized, and transformed into part of imperial identity. This transformation did not happen as a single decision. It unfolded gradually as the needs of empire expanded beyond simple conquest and into administration, science, translation, and intellectual exchange. The empire had inherited a vast world of knowledge from the civilizations it absorbed. Greek philosophical traditions, Persian administrative practices, Indian mathematical systems, medical knowledge from multiple regions that had been connected through earlier empires and trade networks. At first, this knowledge existed in fragments, separated by language, separated by culture, separated by the boundaries of older worlds that had not yet been fully integrated into a single system. But the Abbasid state began to do something different. It began to collect, and in collecting, it began to unify. Within Baghdad, scholars, translators, and officials worked to bring together texts from across the known world. What had once been isolated systems of thought began to interact within a single intellectual environment. And this process slowly gave rise to one of the most important institutions in the Abbasid world, the House of Wisdom. It was not just a building. It was a mechanism, a structured effort to transform scattered knowledge into organized understanding that could serve both intellectual and administrative purposes. Here, translation was not simply linguistic. It was political, because translating knowledge into the language of the empire meant making it usable within its systems. And usable knowledge becomes power. Mathematical works were refined and adapted for practical use in administration, trade, and astronomy. Medical texts were preserved and expanded, improving understanding of the human body in ways that supported both science and state needs. Philosophical works were studied not only for curiosity, but for their implications on governance, ethics, and logic. And over time, this accumulation of knowledge began to reshape the intellectual character of the empire itself. But knowledge, once centralized, creates its own form of power structure, because those who control access to knowledge also begin to influence how it is interpreted. In Baghdad, scholars did not operate in isolation. They existed within a system supported by patronage, political authority, and imperial interest. This meant that intellectual life was not separate from governance. It was embedded within it. And that embedding created both strength and tension. Strength because it allowed the empire to organize knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Tension because intellectual growth often produces ideas that extend beyond political control. As the House of Wisdom expanded its work, it became a place where translation and inquiry reinforced the idea that the Abbasid Caliphate was not only a political system, but also a cultural and intellectual project. A civilization defining itself not just through rule, but through understanding. At the same time, this intellectual expansion reflected a deeper reality of the empire. Its diversity was no longer just a political challenge. It had become an intellectual resource. Persian scholars contributed administrative and scientific traditions. Greek texts provided philosophical and logical frameworks. Indian knowledge added mathematical precision that reshaped calculation and astronomy. And Islamic thought provided the unifying structure that connected these diverse streams into a single conceptual world. But this synthesis was not without complexity, because integration of knowledge also means integration of difference. And difference always introduces debate. Within scholarly circles, discussions began to expand into questions that touched on theology, reason, and interpretation. Not all ideas aligned perfectly, and not all interpretations supported the same understanding of authority or tradition. This did not immediately destabilize the empire, but it added another layer to its complexity. Because now the Abbasid system was not only managing provinces and populations, it was also managing ideas. Meanwhile, outside the intellectual centers of Baghdad, the empire continued to evolve unevenly. In some regions, the influence of centralized knowledge strengthened administrative efficiency. In others, local traditions remained dominant, blending selectively with imperial systems. And in frontier zones, the reach of Baghdad's intellectual influence was limited, creating gaps between the center and the periphery. These gaps were not failures. They were natural outcomes of scale. But they reinforced an important truth. The Abbasid Caliphate was no longer a simple political structure. It was becoming a layered civilization, one held together not only by authority, but by shared systems of knowledge, communication, and belief. And layered systems are both powerful and unstable at the same time, because they can adapt, but they can also drift. By the end of this stage, the empire had reached a new kind of maturity. It was no longer defined solely by expansion. It was defined by organization at scale. And that organization extended beyond land and administration into thought itself. But with that achievement came a quiet question that would grow more important over time. If an empire is held together not only by force, but by ideas, what happens when those ideas begin to move in different directions? Empires are never defined only by their rulers. They are defined by the lives of the people who must live inside their structure. In the expanding world of the Abbasid Caliphate, society itself was becoming more complex, more layered, and more visibly shaped by the systems that governed it. At the center of this transformation stood Baghdad, a city no longer just growing in size, but in meaning. It was here that the structure of imperial life could be seen most clearly, not as abstraction, but as daily reality. Markets filled with merchants speaking different languages reflected the empire's vast reach. Administrative buildings carried the weight of decisions that affected distant provinces. Religious spaces anchored a shared identity that stretched across cultures. And residential districts revealed the quiet hierarchy that existed beneath the surface of unity. In theory, the empire was held together by a shared religious and political framework. In practice, life was shaped by layers of identity, status, and access. At the top of society stood those closest to political authority: caliphal officials, high-ranking administrators, military elites, and those connected directly to the structures of governance. Below them existed a growing class of scholars, merchants, and bureaucrats who formed the intellectual and economic backbone of the empire. And beneath them lay the broader population: artisans, laborers, farmers, whose work sustained the physical reality of the state. This structure was not fixed. It shifted with time, opportunity, and proximity to power. But it created a clear pattern. The closer one was to the center of administration and knowledge, the more influence one could potentially hold. Yet the Abbasid world was not defined only by hierarchy. It was also defined by movement. Trade routes connected distant regions in ways that allowed goods, ideas, and people to circulate across vast distances. Merchants traveled between cities that differed greatly in culture and language, yet were linked through shared economic systems. This movement created a kind of imperial connectivity that was not purely political. It was social. It allowed distant regions to feel part of a larger world, even when their local realities differed significantly. But movement also created imbalance, because not all regions benefited equally from imperial integration. Some cities flourished as trade hubs. Others remained more isolated, dependent on local production and limited external connection. And this uneven distribution of opportunity shaped how people experienced the empire itself. In Baghdad, prosperity and diversity created a sense of central importance. In other regions, the empire might be experienced more as administration than as cultural unity. This difference mattered, because empires are not experienced uniformly. They are experienced locally, and local experience shapes loyalty more than ideology alone. At the same time, religious life continued to serve as one of the strongest unifying forces within the Abbasid system. Islam provided a shared framework that connected diverse populations across vast distances. It defined moral order. It shaped law. It structured daily life. But even within this shared framework, interpretation varied. Different schools of thought emerged in different regions. Legal traditions developed in response to local conditions. And religious scholarship became an increasingly important field of authority within society. This created a dynamic where unity and diversity existed simultaneously. A single religious identity held together multiple intellectual and cultural expressions. And this balance strengthened the empire while also making it more complex to govern. Meanwhile, the role of the administrative class continued to grow in importance. Scribes and officials were no longer just record keepers. They were interpreters of policy, translators of imperial intent into local execution. And as their importance grew, so too did their influence within the structure of power. This shift reflected a deeper transformation within the Abbasid system. Authority was no longer purely personal or military. It was increasingly procedural, based on systems, documents, and institutions that extended beyond individual rulers. This made the empire more stable in some ways, because systems can outlast individuals, but it also made it more dependent on continuous coordination, because systems only function when all parts continue to align. Outside the centers of administration, daily life continued to reflect both the strength and limits of imperial integration. Farmers worked land shaped by taxation systems they did not directly control. Artisans produced goods for markets that connected distant regions, and local communities maintained traditions that coexisted with imperial structures. The empire was not replacing local life. It was layering itself over it. And this layering created both connection and distance at the same time. By this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer simply expanding its reach. It was organizing complexity at scale. A civilization built not only on conquest or faith, but on the management of diversity across geography, culture, and knowledge. But beneath this achievement lay a quiet tension. Because the more complex a system becomes, the more difficult it is to keep all its parts moving in the same direction. And that challenge, silent at first, would begin to define the next stage of its history. Empires are not held together by administration alone. They are held together by the belief that authority has meaning. In the expanding world of the Abbasid Caliphate, that belief was constantly being shaped, reinforced, and quietly questioned. At the heart of this struggle stood Baghdad, a city where politics and religion were never truly separate forces. They existed as overlapping layers of the same system, each shaping the other in ways that were often subtle but deeply influential. The Abbasid rise itself had depended on a powerful claim. That legitimate leadership of the Muslim world was not only a matter of power or conquest. It was tied to a deeper moral and religious principle connected to the family of the Prophet. This claim had helped unify diverse groups during the overthrow of the previous order. But once power was secured, it became something more complicated. Because legitimacy does not end with victory. It must be maintained. And in an empire as vast and diverse as the Abbasids, maintaining legitimacy was not a simple task. Across the empire, people experienced authority through different lenses. In some regions, the Caliph in Baghdad was seen as a central religious and political figure whose authority structured daily life. In others, the Caliph was more distant. His influence filtered through layers of local governors, scholars, and institutions. And in frontier regions, imperial authority could feel more symbolic than direct, shaping identity more than immediate governance. This variation did not weaken the empire immediately, but it introduced a quiet tension. Because when authority is experienced differently across regions, unity becomes interpretive rather than absolute. Within Baghdad itself, religious authority began to develop in more structured and formalized ways. Scholars, jurists, and theologians became central figures in defining how Islamic law and practice should be understood. Their work was not separate from the state. It was deeply connected to it. But it was also not identical to it. Because religious interpretation, once systematized, develops its own internal logic. And that logic does not always align perfectly with political necessity. Over time, different schools of thought emerged, each attempting to interpret religious principles in ways that addressed both tradition and changing social realities. These intellectual developments strengthened the cultural depth of the empire, but they also expanded the number of voices involved in defining authority. And more voices mean more interpretation. And more interpretation means less uniformity. At the same time, the Abbasid state continued to rely on religious legitimacy as a foundation of political stability. The caliph was not only a ruler, he was a symbolic figure representing unity within the Islamic world. But symbolism alone is not enough to govern complexity. It must be supported by systems that function effectively across distance, culture, and administrative layers. And that is where the Abbasid model became both powerful and strained, because it combined centralized symbolic authority with decentralized practical governance. In Baghdad, this balance was managed through a growing administrative class that translated political authority into structured policy. But in distant provinces, the relationship between religious authority and political reality often took different forms. Local scholars gained influence in interpreting law. Regional leaders shaped how imperial directives were applied. And communities adapted imperial identity to local traditions. This created a layered system of belief and authority, one that was unified in principle, but diverse in practice. Meanwhile, theological debates began to grow in importance within the intellectual life of the empire. Questions of reason, interpretation, and divine understanding were not only academic concerns. They had implications for governance, law, and political legitimacy. Because in a system where religion and state are deeply connected, intellectual disagreement can become political tension. This did not immediately fracture the empire, but it added depth to its internal complexity. At the same time, the Abbasid world continued to expand its intellectual and cultural reach, drawing knowledge from Greek, Persian, Indian, and earlier Islamic traditions. This created a rich environment of synthesis and debate. But synthesis is never simple. It requires constant negotiation between different ways of understanding truth, authority, and knowledge. Outside the intellectual centers, everyday life continued under the layered structure of imperial rule. People lived within systems shaped by taxation, law, trade, and religious practice. For many, the empire was not experienced as a single unified idea. It was experienced as overlapping systems that affected different aspects of life in different ways. In this sense, the Abbasid Caliphate was not a single structure imposed from above. It was a network of relationships, institutions, and ideas that stretched across vast distances. And like all networks of that scale, it depended on balance. Balance between center and periphery, between authority and interpretation, between unity and diversity. By the end of this stage, the empire had become something more than a political system. It had become a civilization defined by its attempt to hold together multiple forms of authority at once. But the very mechanisms that made this possible also created the conditions for future strain. Because when authority is shared across systems, it becomes harder to concentrate. And when it becomes harder to concentrate, it becomes harder to control. And that tension would begin to shape everything that followed. There are moments in history when an empire appears not just powerful, but complete, when its structure feels so wide and so connected that it seems it might continue indefinitely. For the Abbasid Caliphate, that moment arrived not through conquest, but through consolidation. It was not the expansion of borders that defined this stage. It was the refinement of what already existed. From the heart of Baghdad, the empire projected a sense of stability that reached across continents. Trade routes stretched from the Mediterranean into Central Asia. Cities flourished under interconnected systems of commerce, taxation, and governance. And knowledge circulated through networks that linked scholars, officials, and institutions across vast distances. From the outside, the Abbasid world looked like a single, coordinated civilization. But beneath that appearance, its strength came from something more complex. It was not uniformity that held it together. It was integration. Different regions retained their local identities, traditions, and administrative variations. Yet all of them operated within a shared imperial framework that provided structure without completely erasing difference. This balance created a system that was both flexible and powerful, but also inherently delicate, because integration requires constant maintenance, and maintenance, over time, becomes more difficult than expansion. At the center of this system, Baghdad functioned as more than a capital. It functioned as a living mechanism of coordination. Goods arrived from distant provinces. Ideas flowed through scholarly circles. Administrative decisions were processed through increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic systems. And political authority was expressed through a combination of governance, culture, and symbolism. The city itself reflected the empire's complexity. Its markets brought together merchants from diverse regions. Its institutions supported scholars working across disciplines. Its administration connected local realities to central policy. And its population embodied the diversity of the empire it governed. But with this concentration of activity came a growing pressure. Because when everything flows through a single center, that center becomes both the strongest point and the most burdened one. Across the wider empire, provincial regions continued to function with increasing autonomy in practice, even while remaining formally connected to the Abbasid structure. Governors managed local affairs with growing independence. Local elites gained influence in shaping policy implementation. And regional variations in governance became more pronounced over time. This was not the result of collapse. It was the natural outcome of scale. The larger a system becomes, the more it must rely on delegation. And delegation always introduces variation. In some regions, this variation strengthened local governance and improved efficiency. In others, it created subtle divergences between central intent and local execution. But in all cases, it made the empire less uniform than it appeared from the outside. Economically, the Abbasid world experienced a level of connectivity that allowed wealth, goods, and ideas to circulate across vast distances. Agricultural production supported large urban populations. Trade networks linked regions that had once been separated by geography and political boundaries. And markets reflected the diversity of a system that was no longer defined by a single cultural or economic identity. Intellectually, this period represented one of the most dynamic phases in the empire's history. Scholars engaged with texts and traditions drawn from multiple civilizations. Knowledge was translated, debated, and expanded in ways that reshaped fields such as mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. But intellectual flourishing also introduced complexity into the empire's cultural landscape. Because the more knowledge expands, the more interpretations emerge. And interpretation naturally produces difference. Religiously and politically, the Abbasid Caliphate maintained its unifying framework through a shared Islamic identity. But even within that framework, diversity of thought and practice continued to grow. Different schools of legal and theological interpretation developed across regions. Scholarly authority became increasingly important in shaping how religious principles were understood in daily life. And this intellectual diversity added depth to the empire's unity, while also making it more complex to govern as a single coherent system. At its peak, the Abbasid Caliphate was not simply powerful. It was layered, a civilization composed of overlapping systems, political, economic, intellectual, and religious, all functioning together without being identical. This layering was the source of its strength. It allowed the empire to adapt, absorb, and integrate vast differences across its territories. But it was also the beginning of its long-term vulnerability, because layered systems depend on alignment across many levels. And alignment is never permanent. It must be continuously maintained. At this stage, there was no visible collapse, no immediate fracture, only a quiet truth emerging beneath the surface of imperial stability. That the very complexity that made the Abbasid world so advanced also made it increasingly difficult to hold together with absolute unity. And as history would later show, empires do not fall when they are weakest. They begin to change when they are at their most complex. Every empire reaches a moment where its greatest strength begins to resemble pressure. For the Abbasid Caliphate, that moment arrived while it still appeared at its most stable. From the outside, the world of the Abbasids still looked unified, prosperous, and intellectually alive. Trade continued to flow across continents. Cities remained active centers of administration and culture, and the authority of Baghdad still stood as the symbolic heart of the Islamic world. But inside that appearance of stability, the structure of power had begun to carry a different weight. Not collapse, not crisis, but strain. The kind that builds slowly, unnoticed at first, until it becomes part of how the system operates. The Abbasid world at its height was not a simple empire anymore. It was a layered civilization. Each layer depended on the others, but each also had its own internal logic. Political authority still rested in the caliphate, supported by a complex administrative system that stretched across vast distances. But in practice, much of the day-to-day governance was carried out by regional officials whose decisions reflected local realities as much as central directives. This was not failure. It was adaptation. But adaptation always comes with consequences, because every adjustment made at the local level slowly reshapes the meaning of central authority. And over time, those small adjustments accumulate into structural change. In Baghdad, the court still represented the highest visible center of power. The caliph remained the symbolic leader of the Islamic world, embodying both political authority and religious legitimacy. But the nature of that authority was becoming more dependent on the systems surrounding it. Bureaucracy had expanded into a vast structure of record-keeping, taxation, and communication. Officials were no longer just servants of power. They were the mechanism through which power functioned. And as their importance grew, so too did the complexity of maintaining coordination across the empire. Because systems that depend on multiple layers of administration require constant alignment. And alignment is fragile over distance. In the provinces, local governors increasingly operated with a degree of independence shaped by necessity. Communication delays made immediate central control difficult. Regional conditions varied widely, making uniform policy impractical. And local elites gained influence by becoming essential intermediaries between imperial authority and local society. This created a subtle shift in how power was experienced. The empire still existed as a single political structure in theory. But in practice, it was becoming a network of semi-autonomous regions held together by shared identity, economic ties, and administrative tradition. Not direct control. In the economic sphere, the Abbasid world continued to thrive through extensive trade networks that connected distant regions. Goods, ideas, and people moved across long-established routes that linked cities from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. This circulation created wealth and cultural exchange on a scale that reinforced the empire's outward strength. But it also increased interdependence. And interdependence, while powerful, introduces vulnerability, because disruption in one region can ripple across the entire system. Intellectually, the empire was still experiencing extraordinary growth. Scholars built upon earlier knowledge traditions, refining and expanding fields such as medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. But intellectual expansion also brought increasing diversity of interpretation. Different schools of thought developed distinct approaches to religious law, philosophy, and governance. These differences did not immediately threaten unity, but they expanded the range of authoritative voices within the empire. And more voices always mean more negotiation. Religious life remained one of the strongest unifying forces across the Abbasid world. Islam provided a shared framework that connected diverse populations across geography and culture. But even within that shared framework, interpretation varied across regions and communities. And these variations reflected the broader pattern of the empire itself. Unified in principle, diverse in practice. Meanwhile, the administrative system continued to grow in sophistication. But its increasing complexity also meant increasing dependence on individuals who understood how to operate within it. Scribes, officials, and bureaucrats became essential to maintaining continuity. And as their role expanded, so did their influence. Authority was no longer purely concentrated at the top. It was distributed across the systems that made governance possible. This distribution allowed the empire to function at scale. But it also meant that control was no longer singular. It was shared across multiple layers of administration, interpretation, and execution. At this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate had not yet entered decline. It remained powerful, wealthy, and culturally influential. But beneath that surface, the structure of the empire was changing shape. Not breaking, not collapsing, but stretching. And every system that stretches across too much distance eventually faces the same question. How long can unity survive complexity before it becomes something else entirely? Empires do not announce when they begin to loosen. They simply stop reacting with the same speed, the same certainty, and the same authority they once had. For the Abbasid Caliphate, this shift was becoming visible not in Baghdad alone, but across the wide spaces between center and periphery. From the heart of Baghdad, the empire still appeared intact. Messages were still sent, governors were still appointed, taxes were still collected, the symbols of unity remained in place, and the structure of authority still existed in theory. But in practice, something quieter was changing. Distance was no longer just physical. It was becoming political. In the earlier stages of expansion, distance had been a challenge of communication. Now it had become a condition of autonomy. Across the provinces, governors who once acted as direct extensions of central authority were increasingly becoming decision-makers in their own right. Not because they had openly rejected the caliph, but because they had learned to govern without waiting. Delays in communication made immediate instruction impractical. Local conditions demanded immediate responses. And over time, necessity became habit. And habit became independence. In many regions, this shift did not appear as rebellion. It appeared as efficiency. Local leaders resolved issues directly. Regional administrations adapted policies to fit local realities. And imperial directives from Baghdad were increasingly interpreted rather than strictly followed. This interpretation did not break the empire, but it changed its internal structure. Because once authority is interpreted instead of obeyed directly, it stops being absolute. It becomes negotiable. Inside the political heart of the Abbasid system, this transformation was not immediately recognized as decline. In many ways, it looked like maturity. The empire was too large to be managed through simple command structures. So it evolved into something more flexible, a system of layered authority in which central power set direction, but local administrations determined execution. This structure allowed the empire to survive its own scale. But it also meant that unity was now dependent on coordination rather than control. And coordination is always more fragile than command. In Baghdad, the administrative system continued to expand in complexity. Bureaucratic institutions became more refined, with specialized roles handling taxation, correspondence, military logistics, and provincial oversight. The state relied heavily on a growing class of officials who understood how to maintain continuity across vast distances. These administrators became the invisible architecture of the empire. Without them, the system would not function. But their importance also introduced a new dynamic. Because power that depends on intermediaries becomes less direct at its core. And less direct power is more difficult to enforce uniformly. In the provinces, local elites began to consolidate influence. Some developed strong regional identities tied to geography, culture, and long-standing local traditions. Others maintained loyalty to the Abbasid center, but increasingly on their own terms. And in frontier regions, where distance from Baghdad was greatest, local governance often became effectively self-sustaining. These changes did not happen uniformly. They unfolded unevenly across time and space. But the direction was consistent. More local control. More regional adaptation. Less direct central intervention. Economically, the Abbasid world still functioned as a connected system of trade and production. Markets linked distant regions. Goods moved across established routes that had been strengthened over generations. Agricultural surplus supported urban populations, while cities served as nodes in a vast commercial network. But economic integration also deepened interdependence between regions. And interdependence, while powerful, creates systemic risk. Because disruptions in one area could now affect multiple others. Intellectual life continued to flourish, reinforcing the cultural cohesion of the empire even as political structures became more flexible. Knowledge moved across borders more easily than political authority. Ideas traveled faster than administrative decisions. And scholars continued to build a shared intellectual world that connected diverse regions under a common framework of learning. But even intellectual unity could not fully erase political divergence. Because ideas do not govern. Institutions do. And institutions were becoming increasingly decentralized in practice. Religious identity still provided a powerful unifying structure across the Abbasid world. Shared beliefs, practices, and legal traditions connected communities across vast distances. But interpretation of those traditions continued to vary. And those variations reflected local realities that central authority could not fully standardize. By the end of this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer a system defined by direct command from the center. It was a system defined by shared frameworks operating across multiple centers of practical authority. Still unified in name, still connected in structure, but increasingly dependent on balance rather than control. And balance, unlike control, is always temporary, because it must constantly adjust to remain stable. And every adjustment changes the system it is trying to preserve. There is a point in every large empire where the edges stop behaving like edges. They begin to act like centers in their own right. For the Abbasid Caliphate, this transformation did not announce itself through rebellion or sudden rupture. It arrived gradually, through repetition, through habit, and through the slow acceptance that local decisions no longer required constant approval from Baghdad. At first, this shift seemed practical. Distant governors were expected to respond quickly to local problems. Communication delays made waiting for central instructions inefficient. So authority, by necessity, began to move downward. But what begins as necessity rarely remains limited to it. Over time, the ability to act independently becomes the expectation to act independently. An expectation becomes structure. In many provinces, regional governors were no longer just administrators executing imperial policy. They were becoming political actors in their own environments. They raised armies, managed taxation, and negotiated with local elites in ways that reflected both imperial loyalty and regional necessity. The result was not immediate fragmentation. It was the emergence of layered authority. The Abbasid Caliphate still existed as a unified political identity. But within that identity, multiple centers of real power were now forming. Some regions remained closely aligned with Baghdad, maintaining strong administrative and symbolic ties to the Caliphate. Others operated with increasing autonomy, shaping their own policies while still acknowledging the legitimacy of the central authority. And in certain frontier zones, the connection to the center had become more symbolic than operational. This uneven distribution of power did not break the empire, but it changed its internal logic. Because when authority is distributed unevenly, governance becomes a negotiation rather than a command. Inside Baghdad, the administrative system continued to evolve in response to this complexity. Bureaucratic structures expanded to manage the increasing independence of provincial authorities. More communication channels were created. More oversight mechanisms were developed. And more effort was placed on maintaining coherence across a system that was no longer uniformly controlled. But every attempt to reinforce central coordination also added new layers of procedure. And every layer increased the distance between decision and execution. In effect, the system was trying to solve fragmentation by becoming more complex. But complexity itself often accelerates fragmentation. In the provinces, this growing autonomy began to produce visible regional identities. Local elites became more influential in shaping governance, law, and economic policy. Military leaders tied their authority to regional stability rather than purely central command. And communities began to see their immediate environment as the primary source of practical governance, even while still recognizing the symbolic authority of the caliph. This dual structure, symbolic unity with practical decentralization, became one of the defining features of the Abbasid world in this phase. It allowed the empire to survive its own scale, but it also made its unity increasingly conditional. Economically, the system remained deeply interconnected. Trade routes continued to link distant regions, and urban centers still functioned as hubs of production, exchange, and administration. Agricultural systems supported large populations, and taxation provided the financial backbone of imperial structure. But the management of these resources was increasingly localized. Regions adapted imperial frameworks to fit their own conditions. And those adaptations, while effective individually, gradually produced variation across the empire. Intellectual life continued to move in parallel with political change. Knowledge networks remained one of the strongest unifying forces within the Abbasid world. Scholars, institutions, and texts created a shared intellectual environment that transcended regional boundaries. But intellectual unity did not eliminate political divergence. It simply coexisted with it. Religious identity remained equally important as a stabilizing force. Islam provided a shared moral and legal framework that connected diverse populations across the empire. But interpretation of that framework varied across regions and scholarly traditions. And those variations reflected the same patterns seen in governance and administration. Unity in principle, diversity in practice. By this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer operating as a strictly centralized empire. It was functioning as a network of interconnected regional powers, held together by shared legitimacy, economic ties, and institutional tradition. The Caliph in Baghdad remained the symbolic center of this system. But the practical center of power was increasingly distributed. And distributed systems behave differently from centralized ones. They are more adaptable, but also more difficult to coordinate. They can survive local disruptions more easily, but they are more vulnerable to long-term divergence. At this stage, there was still no collapse, no singular moment of crisis, only a gradual shift in how power was organized and experienced. A shift from direct control to negotiated authority, from uniform governance to regional variation, from centralized command to distributed coordination. And within that shift lay the beginning of a deeper transformation. Because once power stops flowing primarily from the center outward and begins circulating across multiple centers, the nature of the empire itself begins to change. Not immediately, not visibly, but irreversibly. Empires change fastest when their armies change. Not because battles define everything, but because armies reveal where real power is being held. For the Abbasid Caliphate, the military system was entering one of its most important transformations, and with it, the balance of the entire state began to shift. From the political center in Baghdad, authority still appeared intact. The caliph remained the symbolic head of the empire. Administrative systems continued to function. Provinces still acknowledged central legitimacy. But beneath that surface, the structure of force was no longer the same as it had been at the beginning of Abbasid rule. In earlier generations, military power had been closely tied to the revolutionary networks that brought the Abbasids to power. Loyalty was built through shared struggle, shared ideology, and shared opposition to the old order. But as time passed, that foundation changed. The empire no longer needed revolutionaries. It needed soldiers who could maintain stability. And stability required a different kind of force. This shift gradually led to the rise of a new military structure, increasingly reliant on professional soldiers whose identity was tied less to regional or tribal affiliation and more to service within the state itself. Over time, these forces became essential to the survival of the Abbasid system. They were trained, organized, and maintained through centralized resources, and their loyalty was shaped by institutional dependence rather than local or familial ties. This created a new kind of balance within the empire. On one side stood the traditional administrative and political elites who had long shaped governance through bureaucracy, regional networks, and inherited influence. On the other side stood a growing military class whose power came from organization, discipline, and direct access to the center. Neither side fully controlled the empire alone, but together they defined its structure. And that structure required constant negotiation. Because when military power becomes professionalized and centralized, it also becomes a political force in its own right. In Baghdad, this reality began to reshape how authority functioned. The caliph remained the symbolic center of legitimacy, but the execution of power increasingly depended on military structures that operated with their own internal logic. Command was still centralized in theory, but in practice, it was mediated through institutions that had their own priorities, dependencies, and internal hierarchies. This did not immediately destabilize the empire. In fact, it initially strengthened it, because professional military systems provided greater consistency than older, more fragmented forces. They reduced reliance on regional militias. They improved coordination across distant provinces, and they allowed the central state to respond more effectively to internal and external challenges. But this strength came with a cost, because when an empire becomes dependent on a specialized military class, it also becomes dependent on maintaining the conditions that support that class. And that dependency gradually shifts the balance of power. Across the provinces, the presence of these military structures reinforced central authority in some regions, but also complicated local governance in others. Local elites now had to negotiate not only with administrative officials, but also with military representatives of the central state. And in some cases, military leaders stationed in provinces began to accumulate influence that extended beyond their original mandate. They became mediators of power, not just instruments of it. This change was subtle at first, but over time it altered the internal dynamics of governance. Because once military authority begins to operate with its own autonomy, it becomes a second axis of power within the empire. Meanwhile, the administrative system in Baghdad continued to expand in complexity to manage this evolving structure. Communication between military and civil institutions required coordination across multiple layers. Orders had to be transmitted, interpreted, and enforced across distances that introduced delay and variation. And every layer of mediation increased the possibility of divergence between intention and execution. Yet despite these challenges, the Abbasid system continued to function. Trade remained active across the empire's vast network of cities. Agricultural production supported growing urban populations, and intellectual life continued to flourish, reinforcing the cultural unity of the Abbasid world even as its political structure became more layered. But beneath this surface of continued strength, the nature of authority was shifting. It was no longer concentrated in a single source. It was distributed across administrative systems, military institutions, and regional structures that all depended on one another, but did not always move in perfect alignment. This distribution created resilience, but also complexity. And complexity, once established, cannot easily be reduced without disruption. By the end of this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer defined simply by its political center. It was defined by the relationship between multiple centers of power, administrative, military, and regional, each essential to the functioning of the whole. And within that relationship lay both its greatest strength and its emerging instability. Because when power is shared across systems, stability depends not on dominance, but on balance. And balance, in an empire this vast, is never permanent. Empires rarely lose power in a single dramatic moment. More often, they slowly change shape until what once was authority becomes something closer to presence. For the Abbasid Caliphate, this transformation was becoming increasingly visible in the relationship between the center and everything it once directly controlled. From Baghdad, the caliph still stood at the center of a vast political and cultural world. His name was still invoked across provinces. His legitimacy was still recognized. His court still represented the highest symbol of unity in the Islamic world. But the nature of that unity had changed. Because authority can remain intact in form even after it has changed in function. In earlier stages of the empire, the caliph had been both a symbolic and practical center of power. Orders issued from Baghdad were expected to be carried out directly. Governors acted as extensions of a unified command structure, and military power ultimately responded to a central authority that could enforce its will across the empire. But over time, that direct relationship had been gradually replaced by layers of mediation. Administrative systems now translated imperial intention into local action. Military structures operated with increasing institutional independence, and regional authorities managed daily governance with varying degrees of autonomy. The caliphate still existed as a single entity, but its internal logic had shifted. It was no longer a system where power flowed cleanly from center to periphery. It had become a system where power circulated across multiple layers, each with its own role in maintaining stability. In this new structure, the caliph increasingly functioned as a unifying symbol rather than a direct executive authority. His role was still essential, but it was no longer identical to the role of absolute ruler. Instead, he embodied continuity, legitimacy, and the shared identity that connected diverse regions under a single imperial framework. In Baghdad, this symbolic authority still carried immense weight. The court remained a focal point for diplomacy, culture, and ritual. Ceremonial power reinforced the idea of unity even when practical governance had become more distributed. And the presence of the caliph continued to provide a central reference point for a system that might otherwise have drifted apart. But symbolism alone cannot enforce uniformity across vast distances. And as the empire expanded in complexity, the gap between symbolic authority and practical control became more pronounced. In the provinces, local rulers and administrators increasingly managed affairs according to regional conditions. Some still maintained close ties to the center, carefully aligning their governance with directives from Baghdad. Others operated with significant autonomy, acknowledging the caliph's authority while exercising considerable independence in practice. And in some regions, authority had become so localized that imperial influence functioned more as tradition than as active governance. This shift did not happen through sudden rupture. It developed through accumulation. Each adjustment in response to distance, complexity, or necessity added another layer between the center and the edges of the empire. And over time, those layers transformed the nature of authority itself. Meanwhile, the military system that had once reinforced central control continued to evolve into a powerful institutional force. Professional armies ensured stability and defended imperial boundaries. But their increasing organization also meant that military leadership carried its own internal structure of authority and decision-making. This introduced a second center of influence within the empire, operating alongside, but not always fully aligned with, civil administration. The interaction between these systems created both stability and tension. Stability, because it allowed the empire to function across vast and diverse territories. Tension, because no single authority fully controlled all components of the system. Economically, the Abbasid world remained deeply interconnected. Trade networks continued to link distant cities. Agricultural production supported large urban populations, and commercial activity maintained the flow of wealth across regions that were increasingly diverse in governance and culture. But economic integration also meant that disruptions in one area could affect others more easily. Interdependence strengthened the empire, but also made it sensitive to imbalance. Intellectually and culturally, this period continued to reflect one of the most dynamic phases in the empire's history. Knowledge circulated widely across linguistic and regional boundaries. Scholarly traditions developed and interacted in ways that enriched intellectual life. And Baghdad remained a central hub for the exchange of ideas that shaped science, philosophy, law, and culture. But even this intellectual unity existed alongside political divergence. Ideas moved more freely than authority. And that difference gradually reinforced the layered nature of the empire. By the end of this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer defined by direct central control. It was defined by symbolic unity supported by distributed systems of governance. A civilization held together not by uniform command, but by interconnected layers of authority, culture, economy, and belief. And within that structure lay a quiet transformation. Because when a ruler becomes primarily symbolic and governance becomes distributed, the empire has not disappeared. It has changed form, not into something weaker, but into something more complex. And complexity, once reached, does not easily return to simplicity. It moves forward into whatever comes next. Empires do not always fall because they are attacked. Sometimes they change because they can no longer move at the same speed they once did. For the Abbasid Caliphate, this slowing did not feel like collapse. It felt like maturity at first, like a system that had become too large, too complex, too interconnected to respond instantly to every pressure. From Baghdad, the empire still appeared active and coherent. Messages were sent, laws were issued, trade continued to flow, and the court still represented the symbolic center of a vast world. But beneath that surface, time itself had changed meaning. In the early days of expansion, decisions moved quickly. Authority was direct, immediate, and often personal. A command from the center could travel outward and reshape entire regions in relatively short time. Now every action passed through layers. Layers of administration. Layers of interpretation. Layers of local adjustment. And each layer added delay. At first, this delay was not seen as weakness. It was seen as necessary structure. The empire had grown too large for immediacy. Governance required patience. Communication required systems. Stability required process. But over time, delay becomes more than logistics. It becomes behavior. Provinces began to expect slower responses from the center. Local authorities stopped waiting for immediate instruction and began acting within frameworks they understood to be acceptable. And gradually, the empire began to operate in a rhythm that was no longer unified in real time. It was synchronized, but not simultaneous. That difference mattered more than it first appeared. Because when parts of a system no longer move together in time, they begin to experience reality differently. In some regions, central authority still felt immediate and present. In others, it felt distant and abstract, something acknowledged but not constantly engaged with. And in frontier zones, it sometimes felt almost historical rather than active, something that defined legitimacy but not daily decision-making. Inside Baghdad, the administrative system worked continuously to manage this reality. Officials refined procedures to reduce delay. Communication networks were maintained and expanded. Records were carefully preserved to ensure that decisions could still be traced across distances. But every improvement in coordination also added more structure. And more structure created more steps. And more steps created more time. The empire was not becoming weaker in intention. It was becoming slower in execution. Meanwhile, regional governance continued to evolve under these conditions. Local authorities became more skilled at managing their own affairs without direct intervention. They developed routines for taxation, law enforcement, and economic management that were adapted to their specific environments. These routines were still connected to the Abbasid system, but they were no longer entirely dependent on immediate central direction. This created a new form of stability, one that was based less on command and more on consistency. But consistency across diverse regions is never perfectly uniform. It naturally produces variation. Economically, the empire remained deeply interconnected, but local differences in production, trade routes, and resource distribution became more pronounced over time. Some regions experienced continued prosperity through trade and agriculture. Others faced periodic disruption that required local adaptation rather than central correction. And because responses were increasingly localized, economic patterns began to diverge subtly across the empire. Intellectual and cultural life continued to flourish, but it too reflected this gradual shift in tempo. Scholarly exchange remained active across regions, and Baghdad continued to serve as a major intellectual hub. However, the speed at which ideas influenced governance and society varied from place to place. Some regions integrated intellectual developments rapidly into legal and administrative systems. Others adopted them more slowly or filtered them through local traditions. And some maintained parallel intellectual cultures that coexisted with, rather than fully merged into, the central scholarly tradition. Religious identity continued to function as a powerful unifying force. Shared beliefs, practices, and legal frameworks still connected the empire across vast distances. But interpretation of those frameworks increasingly reflected regional contexts. And this created a system in which unity was maintained through shared foundations, but expressed through diverse applications. By this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer defined by synchronized control. It was defined by coordinated endurance, a system that no longer required everything to move at the same speed in order to remain intact. This adaptation allowed it to survive its own scale. But it also changed its internal nature. Because systems that survive by slowing down eventually become dependent on that slowness. And once a system is built around delay, it becomes difficult to return to immediacy without disruption. The empire had not fallen. It had adjusted. And in that adjustment, it had entered a new phase of existence. One where unity still remained. But time itself no longer moved evenly across it. By the time the internal structure of the Abbasid Caliphate had fully transformed into a layered system of regional power, something outside the system began to change as well. For centuries, the empire had adjusted to distance, internal variation, and administrative decentralization. It had learned how to survive its own size. But now, pressure was no longer coming only from within. It was arriving from beyond the structure entirely. From the center of Baghdad, the empire still appeared symbolically intact. The caliphate still functioned as a reference point of legitimacy. Religious identity still connected vast regions. Trade still flowed across long-established routes. But the world around it was no longer stable in the same way. New political forces were rising across the surrounding regions, many of them shaped by military power rather than inherited administrative continuity. These forces were not trying to preserve the old balance, they were trying to redefine it. And unlike earlier periods of expansion or internal drift, this new phase introduced a different kind of tension. Not slow decentralization, but external compression. Borders that had once been porous now became contested zones. Trade routes that had once been stable now passed through competing authorities. And regions that had once loosely aligned under Abbasid legitimacy were now influenced by multiple overlapping powers. Inside the Abbasid system, this created a difficult contradiction. The empire was still structured for coordination across distance, but the distance was no longer neutral. It was politically charged. Communications still functioned, but it was no longer enough to guarantee alignment. Messages carried across regions passed through more independent authorities than before. Decisions made in Baghdad had to navigate not only geography, but also competing power centers that no longer treated Abbasid directives as absolute. At the same time, the internal structure of the caliphate had already reached its most decentralized form. Regional governors operated with broad autonomy. Military structures had their own internal authority. Local administrations managed their own stability. And the caliph himself remained primarily a symbolic anchor of unity rather than an active controller of the system. This meant the Abbasid world was now holding itself together through inherited legitimacy rather than direct control. And inherited legitimacy, while powerful, weakens when confronted by sustained external pressure. Economically, the system still functioned through long-established trade networks, but those networks were increasingly vulnerable to disruption. Routes that once connected the empire seamlessly now crossed territories controlled by different and often competing authorities. This created fragmentation in flow even before political fragmentation fully occurred. Intellectual and cultural life remained active, especially in urban centers that still benefited from Abbasid-era institutions. But intellectual unity no longer translated into political cohesion. Ideas still moved freely, but governance did not. Religious identity continued to act as the strongest unifying structure, yet even it now operated more as a shared foundation than a direct organizing force. Across the system, the pattern was becoming clear. The Abbasid Caliphate still existed as a concept of unity, but its ability to enforce or maintain that unity had diminished to its final stage. Not absent, not destroyed, but insufficient for the scale of the world it once held together. And as external forces continued to intensify, the empire reached a point where internal adaptation could no longer compensate for external pressure. A structure built to manage complexity within itself was now facing complexity from outside. And that difference marked the beginning of its final transformation. There are moments in history that do not simply end systems, they expose what those systems had already become. For the Abbasid Caliphate, that moment arrived when the remaining structure of centralized authority finally met a force it could no longer absorb, adapt to, or redistribute. From Baghdad, the Caliphate still carried the weight of symbolic unity. The courts still existed. The rituals of authority still continued. The idea of the Caliph as the spiritual and political reference point of the Islamic world still held meaning. But the structure beneath that symbolism had already been weakened into a distributed system of regional powers, fragmented authority, and layered governance. What remained in Baghdad was no longer the full engine of empire. It was the last visible center of a system that had already spread outward into many semi-independent realities. When the external military force finally arrived at the city, it did not encounter a unified imperial machine capable of coordinated defense. It encountered a capital that still represented legitimacy, but no longer fully commanded the structure it once symbolized. The administrative systems that had once bound provinces together were now too dispersed to rapidly unify response. Regional powers were too independent to be easily reabsorbed into a single defense structure, and the long evolution of decentralization meant that coordination, even in crisis, was limited by design. What followed was not simply a military event. It was the collision between symbolic unity and structural fragmentation. Within Baghdad, the court and its institutions still represented continuity, but continuity alone cannot replace coordinated force. The systems that once turned central authority into immediate action had already been stretched across distance, time, and regional autonomy. And so the city, once the defining heart of the Abbasid world, became the stage on which the limits of that world were revealed. When control had been strongest, it had worked through layers of administration, military organization, and regional cooperation. But those same layers, in their fully developed form, now prevented rapid reassembly of a unified defense. The empire had not disappeared before this moment. It had already transformed. What remained in Baghdad was the final concentration of symbolism without the full machinery that once supported it. And when that final concentration was broken, it did not reveal a hidden core of unified power beneath it. It revealed that the core had already shifted outward long before the fall. The significance of the event was therefore not only destruction. It was clarification. It made visible what had been developing across generations, that the Abbasid Caliphate had already moved from centralized empire to distributed civilization, from direct rule to layered authority, from unified command to shared systems of legitimacy. After the fall, what remained was not a single successor structure, but multiple inheritors of its legacy, political, intellectual, religious, and administrative, spread across regions that still carried traces of its former unity. And in that sense, the end of Baghdad as a capital was not the end of the Abbasid world's influence. It was the end of its ability to exist as one center. From that point onward, it lived only in fragments, in memory, in institutions, in ideas, and in the systems that later civilizations would continue to build upon, often without realizing how deeply they still echoed the structure that once tried to hold an entire world together. Empires rarely end when they stop existing. They end when they stop behaving like a single thing. For the Abbasid Caliphate, this final stage was not a sudden disappearance, but a long separation between name and function. From Baghdad, the language of unity still continued. The Caliphate still spoke in one voice. It still issued legitimacy, still represented religious and political continuity, and still served as the symbolic center of a vast Islamic world. But the system behind that voice had become something different. Not broken, not erased, but divided into many functioning parts that no longer needed to move as one to survive. Across the former imperial territories, regional powers now operated with full practical authority. They governed their own cities, maintained their own armies, managed their own taxation systems, and shaped their own political realities. Some still aligned closely with Baghdad, treating the caliph as the ultimate source of legitimacy. Others acknowledged him in name, while operating with near-complete independence in practice. And some regions had developed such strong internal structures that central authority had become more symbolic than operational. Yet even in this fragmented condition, something important remained intact. The idea of the caliphate still existed, and that idea still carried meaning across vast regions. It provided continuity in identity, religion, and historical memory. It allowed diverse political systems to situate themselves within a shared framework, even when their practical governance had diverged significantly. This is why the Abbasid world cannot be described simply as collapse. It is more accurate to describe it as transformation into layered sovereignty, a structure in which unity existed at the level of identity and legitimacy, while power existed at multiple regional centers. In Baghdad itself, the court continued to function as a symbolic anchor. Ceremonies still reinforced authority. Religious legitimacy still flowed from the caliphal institution. And the city remained an intellectual and cultural center whose influence extended far beyond its political control. But its role had changed. It was no longer the sole engine of empire. It was one center among many, even if it remained the most prestigious. The administrative systems that had once connected every part of the empire directly to the center now functioned more as inherited frameworks than active command structures. They continued to exist because they were useful, because they provided continuity, because they allowed different regions to still speak a shared political and cultural language. But they no longer defined every action across the empire. Instead, they supported a system that had become distributed in practice. Economically, the former Abbasid world remained deeply interconnected through trade, agriculture, and urban networks. Markets still linked distant regions. Goods still moved across long-established routes. And cities still depended on shared systems of production and exchange. But economic life was now shaped more by regional conditions than by a single centralized policy. Intellectual life continued to flourish in many centers beyond Baghdad as well, as knowledge that had once been concentrated began to circulate more widely across regions. The legacy of translation, scholarship, and scientific inquiry remained embedded in multiple intellectual traditions. And this diffusion of knowledge ensured that the cultural impact of the Abbasid world extended far beyond its political unity. Religious identity remained perhaps the most enduring form of cohesion. Across fragmented political landscapes, shared beliefs and practices continued to connect communities. Legal and theological traditions provided continuity across regions that were otherwise politically separate. And this shared framework allowed the idea of a single community to persist even in the absence of a single unified political structure. By the end of this long transformation, the Abbasid Caliphate had not disappeared in a single moment. It had been redistributed, its authority divided into layers, its governance localized, its power dispersed, but its identity preserved. What remained was not the empire in its original form, but the afterlife of empire, a system that continued to exist through memory, legitimacy, and cultural continuity, even as its political unity had dissolved into multiple centers of power. And in that final condition lies the most important lesson of its history. Empires do not only end when they are defeated. They end when they no longer need to move as one to function. And when that moment arrives, what remains is not silence, but structure without central command. A civilization still alive in parts, still connected in ideas, still unified in name, but no longer singular in reality. And that is how the Abbasid world passed from empire into legacy. Not with collapse, but with transformation that stretched so long it became history itself.